I guess in the spirit of the interdisciplinary debate that we've been having, I would like to propose 3 general categories, hopefully to bring together all these ideas. The first question is about norm or structure. The second one is about agency and players, and the third one about space. So I guess under the norm, we can talk about this idea of contested narratives, as Khalid Fahmy told us, contested space, contested, conflicted identity in South Africa. But we can also think about informality and the question of definition. Is the formal informal sort of distinction, is informality an alternative structure? Is it inverted structure, or it is anti-structure altogether, as Turner would say in the ritual process? Then the question of agency you can also bring together, and the question of agency, the role of architects as leading role in planning department, as Damon does, as instigators of change, as negotiators between different positions, or disseminators of knowledge, as Superpool does, and also, as Magda says, leading guerrilla-style architecture. Also, under the question of agency, we can address the question of the role of youth, Khalid mentioned, and the question of local governance. And I would like to quote here Diane, very interesting quote. She said, the state needs to think like revolutionaries, and the architects needs to think like the state. And the last one, the issue of space, we can also start to think about mapping, all the question raised about mapping and the scale of intervention, and finally the question of urban citizenship that is very relevant to the conference today. So with that, I would like to open the floor to questions. So maybe you can have a few questions, and then we can go back to the panel. Maybe you can have 2 or 3 rounds, depends of how much time people want to spend. So do we have a mic back there? Okay, so May, you want to say something? Yeah. Yeah, sorry, questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, first of all. Is this on? Yeah. To the organizers and to the speakers and to everyone for attending. I thought I really learned a lot. Arabu. Can you hear me now? Okay, so I was just thanking everyone. I wasn't really, I mean, that's important, but I wasn't. Okay, I think my question, and I think I feel that there is a lack in there's something that needs to be discussed, and that's related to the mechanisms of learning. I feel that we're not talking about this at all, whether in terms of education, so in terms of looking at how architects or urbanists learn in university, etc. مش معقول وعربنا بعدنا. And I haven't heard any reference to it. Maybe it happened in the sessions. I'm sorry I couldn't attend today, but I think it's really important to talk about this. And also, I think the mechanisms of learning, we talk a lot about learning from local initiatives. We talk a lot about learning from what people are doing. We talk a lot about learning from each other, but we don't really talk about how we will do that. And I worry that these 3 days, as interesting as they are, still do not allow us to do that. And I think it's important to address that and to think about what comes next. I would have been more interested to hear about exchanging know-how, about possibilities for further cooperation, about etc. And I'm missing that, and I'd like to hear more about that.
This is actually more of a comment. For lack of a better word, for the informal, there was actually one suggestion in the first panel from Mohammed to use self-organized as a word. And then self-service city was used for Istanbul previously also, which is also a nice term. I just wanted to. Self-service city.
Since we're talking about naming, I had another one in mind, which is popular urbanism. I'm not sure how.
I think that can go anywhere, though. So you might end up with pop art with that one.
Yeah, one of the things that I feel, although it came up sort of in passing, but I think is a missing element, is the whole question of how the communities can be organized. I mean, the term self-organization kind of suggests how they got to where they are. They organized it themselves, although I think nothing will bring out the government in a state of horror more than the concept of tanzim zati. That will bring them rushing forward in a panic. But I mean, how do you organize the local community? Because if you cannot organize the local community, whether it is to improve the level of services that are available or more likely to demand the missing services which have to be provided by the government, then you're sort of stuck. I mean, there are lots of good ideas, there are lots of suggestions, but how do you really mobilize people on a broader scale, community by community? I think that there have to be community-level organizations, which are a real lack here, and those have to be able to deliver services to some extent, but even more important to not necessarily ask, to demand from the government that there be a response to their needs.
نبيل الهادي. انا اقتراحي البسيط ان احنا ولا نقول informal ولا نقول فورمال، ما نقولش حاجه خلاص. اعتقد مشكله الليبلنج، مشكله الاسم دي اعتقد مشكله كبيره. فانا اعتقد ان احنا محتاجين ننسى ان في حاجه اسمها فورمال وحاجه اسمها انفورمال. محتاجين نتكلم على بيئه عمرانيه مركبه، متهيألي كده مش محتاجين خالص، لان اعتقد شغلانه التسميه مشكله تاني بتزود وات ايفر، حتى مهما كانت الاسم عامل ازاي. اعتقد محتاجين ننسى ده بالنسبه للاسم. اعتقد عندنا مشكله كبيره، ولازم نعترف ان البيئه العمرانيه عندنا مركبه للغايه. ما ينفعش ولا ان احنا نتجاهل الانفورماليتي او الاماكن اللي هي فيها ظروف معينه نسميها زي ما نسميها، وما ينفعش كمان نتجاهل بقيه المدينه. اعتقد الشغلانه مهمه خالص، محتاجين ان احنا نعترف بالاثنين مع بعض. لكن المشكله الكبيره الثانيه اعتقد اللي هي مواجهانا كلنا، ان الجامعات المصريه باكملها يعني على حد علمي لا تعترف بوجود البيئه المركبه دي. يعني قصدي ولا في الديزاين ستوديوز بتاعتهم مش موجوده، ولا في البلاننج ستوديوز موجوده ساعات بس على استحياء التعامل مع البيئه بصوره مركبه. اعتقد عندنا مشكله كبيره جدا، وفي غياب للرؤيه للبيئه بالبيئه العمرانيه بالصوره المركبه بتاعتها. في غياب جامد جدا او حقيقي في كل مؤسساتنا التعليميه، ومن غير ما يبقى في اعتراف بالنوع المركب للبيئه اللي احنا عايشين فيها في المؤسسات التعليميه بتاعتنا، عندنا مشكله كبيره. هنعمل ازاي؟ يعني هنتصرف ازاي؟ هي بس المناطق اللي موجوده في القاهره وفي غيرها هنكتشفها بعد ما نتخرج لو حد جاله فرصه ان هو يعمل ما اعرفش كذا، ولا هنعمل ايه؟ اعتقد عندنا مشكله جوهريه. اعتقد خليني اقول لك
برد على سؤال مي، ايه الطريقه اللي ممكن
طبعا احنا عندنا مشكله كبيره. انا بس يعني في نقاشات، عندنا نقاشات مهمه. اعتقد عندنا نقاش قريب في جامعه القاهره على الاقل على ازاي يبقى عندنا رؤيه للعمران. وواحده من الارجيومنتس المضاده، يعني المقترح بتاعي ان احنا كان لازم يبقى عندنا رؤيه للعمران. المقترح المضاد بيقول ان الدوله ما عندهاش رؤيه، ازاي احنا يبقى عندنا رؤيه؟ وعندنا مشكله كبيره على مستوى بس في كل الاحوال اعتقد اللي انا كنت بقوله ازاي يبقى عندنا مناطق نسميها عشوائيه ولا نسميها غير رسميه ولا ما نسميهاش حتى، والكليه لا تعترف بيها، ما تقولش ده تحدي عمراني رئيسي واحنا مش قادر، ولازم ينعكس على المنهج بتاعنا. للاسف الشديد نتيجه ان احنا برضه مصممين ان احنا مستسهلين يعني كلنا ان احنا نمشي بنفس الطريقه اللي موجوده، ففي الاخر خلاص وار جوينج. فاحنا كل اللي بيحصل انها التعامل مع المناطق المركبه في القاهره بيبقى مجهودات فرديه. اعتقد ما نقدرش نستمر كده، عندنا مشكله حقيقيه محتاجين نعمل كده. وطبعا انا يعني قصدي احنا بنحاول، انت عارف، بس المحاولات اعتقد عايزه تبقى كبيره جدا وعايزه تبقى مؤسسيه، ومن غير ما المحاولات دي تبقى مؤسسيه عندنا مشكله كبيره.
Thank you. It's more a comment in the discussion, really. I think that, I wanted to pick up on Mai's question of not just, and she's left. I want to pick up on Mai's question and add to it, and not to say, I think how do we learn is a critical question, but I think also for those of us in the room who've been talking about research and practice, how we produce knowledge together from here is also a very important question. And I think one of the things in our session that I really liked was this question of why can't we seem to be so uncertain about this question of data. And I don't think it's a question of data, I think it's a question of empirics. And there's a difference, because empirics, there is a way to think about how do we understand what's happening. And that's something that none of us can do alone. And so in some sense, putting together and coordinating our efforts to ask multiple empirical questions at 20 sites across Cairo, if each of us does a small, what we think is a small study, but if 50 people do 50 small studies, the ability to aggregate and give insight is enormous. I'm struck by the fact that the one set of data that Yahya put up on the different types of tenure legality in Egypt was from a study done by De Soto. And I don't understand why that should be so. And I think if we let go of the power to produce data ourselves from the ground with communities and with our students. And I think this is where going back to people-led and self-enumerated data projection, because of course empirics are the most political act in knowledge production, right? You ask particular questions to get particular answers, and there is lies, damn lies, and statistics. We know this. So I think we have to take back the empirics of knowledge production and saying, what is it that we want to know about how the city is actually being built? And I wanted to link it, and I think this is one concrete thing that can come out of this group of people being in a room together, which is a coordination of empirical inquiry in Cairo. The second thing I wanted to say is that I think the question of informality also should not be it's not about finding another word. I mean, that in a sense is academic roulette. I mean, we can each name it 20,000 things and publish it 7 times pretending it's something new that no one has said. Right? We know how to play this game. We were trained well. But I think the question really is, why did we use the word in the first place? We were trying to capture something. And I think what we need to do is to go back to something. Why do we care? Is it because of service? Is it because you can't get a loan on a thing without registering your title? Is it because you can get evicted? Is it because you won't finish the paint and look like brick all the time? So the question, I think, is to go back to the point of vulnerability that informality was meant to be a placeholder for, and say, are you vulnerable because you are informal in these particular ways? So we need to get to that mechanic.
Document, because I agree with Nabil, if it comes in institutionally and having like an international mandate or charter that legitimizes this dialogue, because when you bring it on an individual level, Omar and I have tried, and you try and pitch the idea, it's not met with a lot of enthusiasm, but if you come in with some sort of international charter that tells you that this is important, then you have more support for that. So there is some hope. I hope we can move it forward.
Okay, I know we have Kareem, Dina, and Aida, Muhammad, and Truth. So let's start the floor again and come back. So let's have 3 floors, 3 questions of the floor, and 3 comments.
Yeah, it's a sort of a comment and a question at the same time. I just want to follow the lead of those who have gone and here raised. And I think the issue here is not to accumulate knowledge about the city, but to construct knowledge about the city. I have real doubts about the information we're disclosing among the public, sorry to say that, but it's, most of them are not really grounded on realities. And rather than searching the question of formal and informal, but look at like performance-based, like standards that we've discussed so many times, is that what are the realities of the city like today, actually? How many areas are deprived from constant service of water, of access to electricity, or whatever, or paving, road paving, whatever, schools. One of the shocking experiences I have, like very lately, is that the new urban plan for Urbana, it says that Urbana is likely 64 schools. Imagine that, like one neighborhood is missing 64 schools. You know, it's underserved in this very little, so there is like deep inequality in the city. And I think one of our goals is to start to look on the different neighborhoods, on even like to deconstruct the city into different layers of understanding. And I think this will shift our view to the city. The question is, what can we learn from each other actually? How can India look at like your cities or like in Egypt? I think this is one of the major potentials that we can push forward. What is really meaningful to people? When we talk to people in neighborhoods, nobody discusses the word participation. It's not raised at all. They talk about like their share of like resources, how they can distribute it equally within the city, and concept that really really means something to their neighborhoods, even if it comes within a dictatorship.
I think we're hooking on to that learning issue, and to continue on Gautam's comment on the need for a new epistemology, and picking up on what Karim said, we need to know the reality, but we also need to know the perceptions and the cognitions, because they do play a role and manifest themselves. So both are relevant. But then we have a problem of resistance, going back to Nabil and the formal education system. There is resistance within the disciplines for transdisciplinarity. And there is a need and a thirst and a lack of transdisciplinary constructs and methods. And this is something that is delaying the solution. This coordination that we are dreaming of is resisted within each discipline, because it will, I don't want to say disqualify, but it will bring out of the arena, and maybe in terms of urbanists and architects, out of jobs.
What do you suggest to counter that resistance?
The inherited theories in our field, in architecture and urbanism of the 20th century, the standards of how many schools a neighborhood requires, a lot of things have to be revised in a new light. That is, for example, if you go to an urban sociologist versus an architect, both have shortages. The sociological research never captures the built environment, and does not describe it. It talks about relations between neighbors in new cities. And there is current research, that tells us about new cities in Egypt and the problems of lack of social interaction, slow community building, all kinds of things. And it does not capture and describe the built environment in equal depth as social relations, and vice versa. We go and we only do structuralist research, the built environment, we observe behavior, and then we jump into journalism and we make assumptions and deductions. And we lack completely the social science rigor of research in our discipline. And this is where the field which we have to all open up and learn from each other and work together to coin a new language that is common among us. Otherwise, we won't proceed.
Aida, and then lady in the back, and then we go to the panel. Then we have another round of this side. We have time.
Okay, so I'm not an architect, so I feel a bit out of place, but here it goes. I was a panelist with Laura. And I want to talk about something very kind of basic for me that I thought our panel needed to be addressed more, which is public space and ownership for public space. Because if we need to do any transformation or any change or self-organizations or working with local communities, I think it's very important to raise the question of ownership. When I was screening the film about sexual harassment, for me in this context it's not about sexual harassment, but it's about the physical war that before the revolution was psychological, but now there is a physical war. It's very violent between men and women, and we can see it in the Selfservice or with women, going out with knives or whatever to protect themselves in different places and transportation. We can also see it between people in authority when in the clashes that takes place all around Egypt, or we can also see it between different citizens of different religions. Are you allowed to go to church? Are you not allowed to go to church? How much are you allowed, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very important right now to address this subject in order to do the change and to interact with the community, because it's becoming very violent, it's becoming very physical, it's a war on the ground, it's no more. It's not anymore psychological, and to build anything or to transform anything, we need to also talk about those dynamics. Thank you.
I just want to link back to the education thing that Dr. Nabila, Dr. Dina was saying. Being a fresh grad myself, there's something that we should focus on. There's quite a big difference between injecting this new perceptions or these things we're working on about informality or visiting informal settlements and adding them to design courses or adding them to university courses, and between how this could be really implemented in practice. Myself, I've been exposed to such an experience. I worked this in university, and it's quite nice to do research, intense research, and we have lots of projects. We produce, like you said, 500 research projects in every university and every class. But what's really important, how can you address these research things, so things not just implemented, but realized in real life. I know if we could even think how many courses that address this and produce how many research, and then what's done after that. Many people like myself, we don't have so many chances in doing something that's real. And maybe this is what we need to focus on, not just putting it in a university curriculum, but more of how can we use these curriculums to benefit the community and benefit other people than ourselves. This is more than just adding it to the course.
Go work with Kareem.
I am already.
Joseph Khalid.
I just want to say a couple of points. I think what Jennifer was saying, I slightly disagree because I reach to encourage mobilization, and people do come together when you have the community of Ramlet, Boulay, organizing, self-organizing, calling the media, setting up a projector and a screen to have a presentation, to talk about their issue. They're not needing more mobilization. And then when they protest down the street to be visible, to demand from the state their rights, what happens? They get called Baltadeya, they sometimes get attacked, and the end of the story. So I don't think mobilization is what we're really lacking. This levels the issue as if the state is receptive and it's just waiting for people to organize and present clear ideas. I think that's not what is chic or what is middle class. And if they have more money, then they'll do it out of marble. And if they have more money, then they'll do it out of more expensive material. So these standards are really, I think, getting in the way of how people view their built environment. So this is one thing to point out. And then the final thing I wanted to point out, just as another to use this opportunity, is sometimes there are things that don't make sense in the sense that you'll find in all the brochures and advertisements for the new communities, including the future visions of the state, like Cairo 2050, the sort of fetish of trees and green space. Yet, at the same time, it's the municipality that's going around and butchering trees all over the city, and it's fencing green space that already exists. So I'm not quite sure how that's sort of projected as a desirable future when what we have is not being maintained, and how do we talk about this? And this applies to many other things. Maybe I'll just end here too.
Can I just respond to the governing?
We invited at least five institutions. Today the vice governor of Giza was supposed to come, and he just called before the session. He said they were having demonstration in front of their headquarters, so he couldn't come. And we also invited another big institution, and the response was, if we're not on the podium as one of the speakers, we're not interested in coming. So there's issue of centralization that people are, you need to go to them, and they're not really, interested in coming and engaging in discussion. Just to respond to that, but we did just invite people. Yeah.
Well, Omar, I think we call that a training opportunity. And maybe just speaking, building on that, there was one feature of our panel that I left out, I just omitted. And that was actually very interesting, where Gautam was giving us an example of a community, Ashok, in Delhi, on the banks of the Yamuna River, that has been unceremoniously and violently demolished and evicted. And this was presented as kind of a precursor of what one can expect in Cairo. Of course, we have forced evictions in Cairo. Not so many of the landlord-tenant dispute types of evictions, but we have violent evictions of the poor, and thousands by the year of persons affected. Now, how do planners overcome this dilemma of being trained to plan something before it exists, and then you have to overlay a plan on a city that's already built by its inhabitants? Well, the prediction, I think, is clear in the presentation that Yahya Shawkat gave. The 2050 plan has overcome that dilemma, and the professionals who come up with these visionary, some of them rather obscene, but nonetheless visions of what the future of Cairo should be, they've overcome the dilemma by simply eliminating the people. And there in the profession is, like in a stratified society and an authoritarian government, a characteristic contempt for the poor. And here the question of class is very much evident. It's also very important to point out that this and many other forced evictions in India have happened in the world's largest democracy, and that the prospect of these kinds of violations and all the deprivation that arises from them could very well happen in a post-revolutionary Egypt. So it seems that the question is rather urgent. How does one address the professional ethics of architects and planners and local government in ways that are more consistent with the rights and needs of people, and lead to remedies that are not so costly? In the issue of producing information, we've always been saying that displacement by whatever means deepens poverty. We're challenged to produce that data, and some of you know the efforts that we've undergone to do that. That's maybe not the job of the architect and the planner, but it's important to note that the consequences of this plan is the loss of livelihood, the loss of jobs, increased costs, inheritance, social standing, social capital, and all of these things. So it's very encouraging to hear that UNESCO is coming up with a new international charter on architectural education, and it also seems to coincide with an effort of the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council to address the human rights obligations of local government. And why don't we have a human rights code of conduct for architects and planners and local government so explicitly as we do for lawyers, physicians, medical professionals, police and law enforcement officers? It's no less consequent for the people who come in contact with it.
Yes. I have a question before we need to think about the time.
Now, of course, I want to comment on this formal, informal kind of definition, and what Nabil mentioned was very inspiring in terms of saying, okay, why name it at all? I totally agree that naming or labeling is very value added. So it comes with conceptions, implementations, and so on. And it usually has to do with what needs to be done with these areas. So if you say informal, then you want to make it formal. If you say unplanned, it means that you want to plan it, and so on. I also like very much what Nabil said in terms of let's move from describing the symptom to describing the causes, actually. What is an informality that is really not as good as the rest of the city? Is it vulnerability? Is it poverty? Or is it inequality or whatever? So this is very important, but the issue comes here that how to change this perception and rhetoric. I totally agree that we are isolated community. We usually convene together and we are convinced of that, but the rest of the world outside does not see informality the way we see it. So how to change that? I think this is very challenging, and I think I learned personally from this conference the importance of working on the tools of communication. We need to sharpen our tools of communication. And I think the easiest frontier to conquer is actually universities. Yes, universities don't buy in this multidisciplinary, this seeing the urban environment as a complex phenomenon and so on, but at least they are the closest to get convinced, and then not only professors and faculty, but also students and so on. And from that, we need to see how to engage with government and with media as well as we have mentioned.
Okay, we have Katya. Is there a question, Katya? Then we have somebody in the back. Then Omea, this gentleman here, there, Victoria, and Diane, and that's it. I'm sorry. Okay, that's it. I think we have like 10 questions.
I keep it brief and pragmatic in German and go straight to the point. What next after this event? I relate also to Dina's question, basically, how do we coordinate better? How do we fill the gap, which was raised earlier on between government, local government, and so on. I would like to offer actually a next follow-up session on this, maybe in a smaller group, to discuss with development partners actually who are engaged in different areas in Egypt, to see how we bridge the gap actually and what capacities are needed from these so-called activists here in this room, which I really enjoy the spirit that I can see here, but how do we go next and how do we make it real rather than having one conference after the other?
Okay. Is somebody at the very back had a raised question? Yeah, please.
In the interest, somebody was mentioning about being more multidisciplinary, and one of the things I feel we didn't talk about enough, I think, is something around identity, politics, and space. And one of the questions I raised at the end of our session that we didn't quite get to talk about properly is local level popular committees and decision making regarding things like water and sanitation and gas supply. Some of the examples given from Talamun, you know, there are clear priorities coming from local residents around these issues, but yet, as we know in Egypt, and I think from the example of South Africa in the first session, many people still vote nationally in terms of identity politics and affiliations and their alignment. And I think what I wanted to ask is, what is the role for combining community participation and community-led projects around specific issues with kind of the telling of multiple histories and narratives, particularly in Cairo, given recent brutality and violence and the fact that people need to tell their stories. And I'm thinking in terms of the future of space and how we use space, drawing on my experiences in Northern Ireland. And one of the ways in which in Northern Ireland we dealt with this issue of kind of multiple narratives and histories and relation to violence and the use of space and planning for the future was in many ways just to erase these multiple representations of identity. And I think this is sad, you know, in order that you have spaces that are open access and that people feel like they all have ownership over, that you somehow erase these kind of multiple stories of the past. And I think it's something that we can't ignore. And most of the people I speak to have a story that they feel they need to tell that is important in terms of future planning, I think, and the way that we perceive space and personal identity. So just a comment really in the question.
طيب النوشن بتاع فورمال وانفورمال الريستراوس والباينري بوزيشنز، واحنا عارفين ان احنا في شيدد جراي ارياز ما بين الانفورمال والفورمال. بس لو هنتكلم على انه عنوان المؤتمر دروس من القاهره، فانا بدعو كل الناس اللي موجودين، بما ان كلنا بنشتغل هنا وبنشتغل في مدن مماثله. احنا حقيقي جيل مر بثوره، وجيل كلنا مرينا بيها بمختلف عمرنا، وكلنا بنحاول نكسر الاستراكشر وبنحاول نكسر القوانين وبنحاول نكسر الكونستيتيوشن. والحقيقه ان انا عارفه ان المؤتمر ده كلنا بنطرح اسئله اكتر ما عندنا اجابات، لان احنا لسه بنمارس. والحقيقه ان انا نفسي ان احنا نبص شويه على الممارسات اللي في الشارع اللي بتخلي الناس تنزل على المنتزه وما الى ذلك، لان اللي عاملين المدينه وكلنا علينا دور في ده من مواقع مختلفه، من الانثروبولوجي والسوسيولوجي والاركيتكتشر والاربن بلاننج وكل حاجه. ونبعد شويه عن فكره الموديل، يعني هو احنا بنقول فورمال وانفورمال، قاعدين اصلا كأن عندنا موديل يوتوبي، في موديل يوتوبي للحياه، وده اللي الثوره كمان خلقته فينا. احنا كنا فاكرين ان في موديل يوتوبي، وتخيلنا ان احنا الثوره لما حصلت ان انا لو بكره بقيت وزير الاسلام هقدر اعمل حاجه، وده مش حقيقي. ولو كان مش مرسي اللي موجود بداله واي حد موجود بداله برضه ما اظنش ان حد لسه عنده رد على الاسئله، لانه العالم بينهار، العالم بينهار، الراسماليه منهاره، الليبراليه الجديده منهاره، كل الوشوش دي منهاره، فاظن احنا كلنا في العالم مش مرتاحين وبنحاول ندور برضه على ستراكشر جديد نحاول نحط نفسنا فيه، واظن انه اتس ماتر اوف تايم اند براكتس عشان نقدر نتكلم عنه فعلا. شكرا.
أنا عايز أتكلم على نفس النقطة اللي طرحت كذا مرة وهي وفلاش ده طرح كتير هو واتس نيكست، وبين هو واتس نيكست مهم جدا إن هو يكون أون ذا جراوند، لأن إحنا دي حاجة برضه إحنا متفقين عليها زي ما إحنا موجودين جدا. في بوتنشال كتير قوي ما بين الفريش جرادز وما بين الناس الصغيرين ان هم عايزين يعملوا حاجه، بس فكره الجوريلا اركتيك اللي هي مسيطره علينا واحنا بنحاول نعمل الحاجه دي ما اعتقدش انها نافعه، لان احنا قصادنا يعني في جوريلا اركتكتس احنا we're confronted by hardware. فبالتالي what's next is my concern also.
Two comments, quick comments. One, there was a gentleman here on the first day who was actually from Aslat al-Hagana, from the local. I think it would have been nice to have more of that, to hear from the people themselves. It was very short intervention he made, but it conveyed very intense and to the point experience. Oh, not experience, that is not the right word, but yeah. Another thing, and I know that there is this project of Ibn Beta, but I don't know if there's been an experiment of duplicating what happens in these laws. What happens is they have a guy who has a fandam or half a fandam, or I don't know, 7 irats, and he sends them by the irat, and he makes the streets himself, and the streets are, he decides it's 5 meters or 6 meters or whatever. I wonder if there's been an experiment to duplicate the mechanisms that actually happen on the ground. Yes, thank you.
Good comment. We also invited several local NGOs. I think the space here makes them uncomfortable. I think we need to change the format. Maybe we need to go to them, but we did invite many of them. Thank you for that.
Well, he was there, but it was very nice to
Sorry, just as the political scientist and among others here, but one of the things I'm surprised at the conference, and it's not at all any kind of critique or anything, but sort of I haven't heard very much about the ruling party and its vision of architecture or its vision of housing, and it's something we want to write about in Tadaman, but it's just really interesting as a kind of a comment, this transformation, this revolution. Usually you have architects that want to destroy buildings and build new symbolic architecture when you have these kinds of transitions, and I just, you know, sort of aesthetically, structurally, what's the Salafi architecture going to look like? What's the Muslim Brother? I mean, I'm very serious about this because and what are the different political parties? Because again, other moments of transition, it's political parties that step in. It's the professional class and the, you know, and this is also a comment about Muhammad al-Shahid's point about class. You know, the class aspects of the revolution are there, and this is a debate, but I mean, is there intra-class? Is there conflict with class? Is that going to grow as the economy worsens? So I'm just wondering about the relationship between architects and public resources, and building
and political parties and elections. And I'm just kind of surprised that I don't hear a lot about the new government, and not even all sorts of debates about what to do about how to reform government, but just I don't hear very much about the parties and the Salafis and the Muslim Brothers and architecture and all of these issues.
Victoria and then I think we gotta go and have
Okay, just to thank you, Maya, for bringing back the topic of the education. As an educator, I would love again to talk as an educator, so self-referential. I was very inspired by you two guys, but it's super cool from Istanbul in a sense of let's collect data and then we'll see what to do with it. Maybe we will propose to have a bicycle path around Cairo, we will see. I was inspired, well, by many of you, thank you very much. And I was thinking, okay, how can, we don't have data, we were discussing all the time that we don't have real data, so let's try to join everything together. So the education, the data, and the proposal that we can afterwards reach with the data. So why don't we teachers try to link together, thinking about a format that you can apply in the different universities at the same time, with the same pool of people, try to get involved with the students to collect primary data. I don't know, the Cairo University started with something, the AUC started with something else, the GUC starting again with something else. We go around, we pool of people taking with us not only architects but sociologists and whatever, explaining to students how to collect this primary data. And let's try to produce it, and then we can just bring it somehow on the table and see, okay, this is dangerous data, so let's keep to this dangerous data, as Beth this morning was pointing out, some data could be against us. These are more positive data, well, maybe we can try to work on this and build up new know-how from one side, or practical proposal that we can just propose and see afterwards what happened from the municipal or whatever level. So this could be a practical result from this conference from my side.
The last word from the floor. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to make a few leading comments. The one is really, I think the issue of rights to the city is something that still needs to be at the forefront of the discussion. And I think rights can be articulated in maybe two streams of thinking. The one is the sort of enumeration of access to goods and services, infrastructure, etc. Those are things we can measure. We can talk about access to education. We can talk about the distance to public transport. We can talk about quality of life in a sort of empiricist, or let's call it data sort of perspective. But I think there's also the moral perspective about the right to the city. And I think that has a totally different discourse, which is very difficult to measure. And that's where we require a transdisciplinary conversation, because that has to do with the values and the ethics, both of the professionals operating within the city, the values and the ethics of agency, whether it's local government or the state, or civil society in terms of the people who are commissioning and asking for projects to proceed. Because if we measure the success of human settlement through the tools of measuring degrees of vulnerability, you can lose the immeasurable dimension about whether one has a right to occupy the city and a right to be in the city. And that is an ontological question. And I specifically say this because I've read a number of times where the code for formal and informal takes on the word right versus wrong. Now, if that code subsists within this dialogue about informality and formality, then by implication, it means that a certain sector of society is right and another sector is wrong. And unless you begin to engage with that immeasurable qualitative dimension, then what you will find that the seeds of revolution will articulate themselves, but only on a different level of an interpretation of vulnerability. It might be potholes that are the big issue 30 years from now, unless you begin to address class and stratification. And I say this particularly because I think Egypt is very fortunate to be still at the sort of honeymoon period of the revolution, as opposed to South Africa, which maybe made the mistake of not asking serious, self-reflexive questions about its own values. We went hell-bent and said, we're going to give houses, we're going to do water. We did the numbers game, and we're fighting today. So I think if there's one thing that I can say as a South African to yourself, gather the data, tick the boxes, imagine what you can do the designs, but I think there's an existential, even an ontological debate that needs to be had, which can possibly only be addressed by sociologists about class, structure, and stratification, because all you will do is reproduce patterns of inequality, although you will find different metrics to measure it.
Okay, Laura, I have
last word, Amr. Okay, so Amr and Laura, then I will have to.
What I wanted to say has been addressed, and so you can go on.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we always find ourselves in this situation at the end of every conference, where we're saying what's next, you know? And I think what's next is always another conference. And I really think that's due to the fact that we're not facing up to the real agonizing questions. When this issue of education and the role of education is raised, we jump into solutions like, okay, let's get the students together, the information for us or something like that. And I think I'm not undermining it, but I think there are more serious questions that we should be facing about even our roles as educators. And when we say we're learning from Cairo, are we really learning in the sense time for, and Mukina's remarks about the values and ethical dimensions of the question are very important for us as professionals to raise. And I think there's an opportunity in this time of flux to consider a paradigm shift about our professional approach to things, and whether we are simply beating around the bush and going around in circles, recycling our old ways of doing things, or are we really questioning them critically and wondering whether I'm going into the classroom to teach the students, or authentically to learn from them something, and in that process a new form of education comes out. Thanks.
Just something very quickly, what next kind of answer. We will be running, hopefully, during this next year, and I've talked to McCain about this, what we call Global Studio. Global Studio is an initiative, and Quantum has also discussed this with me, that is the perfect platform for us to do what Vittorio was talking about, bringing together different players in an educational environment with our students to do projects that addresses kind of these issues on a global platform. So I'll be in touch with others to move that forward.
It'd be great. One suggestion.
Yes, 2 practical suggestions as well. If our next event becomes a conference, which seems to be inevitable, so I suggest to have more space for networking. It seems that everybody is valuing the importance of networking. And networking here is not just exchanging cards, it's about also discussing what we do and how can we do things together. So I suggest to have some networking sessions, like sort of rooms where people enter under a certain theme and start discussing how to do things together. My second suggestion is I'm still obsessed with communication and communication tools, and I don't want to pose a challenging task for you, Omar, but it's very important. How are the proceedings of this conference are going to be documented and communicated? This is very important. We're talking about a different way of communication and to which audience. So this is, I think, very important.
Sorry, but just one. I think just to stress the point, we can't really learn from Cairo or do anything about Cairo as long as we keep forgetting and maintaining the centralization of Cairo and forgetting about Tanta, Mansoura, Esna, Asyut. We can actually have a
a reversal effect. The centralization of the country has left all these medium and small-sized cities kind of waiting for 30, 40 years for us as architects and planners and policymakers to go in and test policy interventions that will then come back to Cairo in some shape or form. So just to put that in context.
Great. Response also, we send invitation to at least 5 regional universities, including us. Nobody comes. What can we do? Grab them by the hand. Okay. All right. Okay.
The same would happen in every other country, even in European countries like
We talked in person to people to come, and they promised that they didn't come. I mean, it's central. Okay. Another lesson to learn. Okay. There will be a publication. There will be a publication. We'll be working on it. We have all the materials documented. We will work the next few weeks to transcribe that and come up with sort of coherent documentation of the conference, including the presentations. If you have any suggestions or contribution, we'll be happy to listen to it. Please come to me or Beth or Magda or any of our team. I would like to thank everybody for such a wonderful evening. It's been a wonderful 3 days. I know everybody worked hard, but I think it was worth it. I know it's an inconclusive conference, but I think that's the state of becoming we're at. I would like to thank support from Ford Foundation. I would like to thank our partners at AUC with all the faculty and schools. And I would like to also especially thank our advisory committee. I'm going to say the names because they've been very wonderful to us. Khaled Abd Halim, Mail Abrashi, Nabil Ladi, Muhammad Shahid, Karim Ibrahim, Liha Shawkat, and Dina Shahib, where we have an incredibly energetic team. Joseph, what is Nada, Yasmina, and Amy. Okay, and many others. And thanks for our technical support team. Enjoy your evening, and we hope to see you in the next conference. Thank you.